Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm Jeremy Schumacher. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm the Jer in Wellness with Jer. And today I'm going to talk about The Patient. A couple of my clients have asked me if I've watched it. It comes up somewhat frequently as a therapist to be like, ooh, there's a therapy show out. Have you watched it? And usually, honestly, I avoid them because they're terrible. Therapy shows always include like a therapist sleeping with their clients, which is a thing that does indeed happen rarely, and people like leave the profession because of it. Not a thing that happens all the time, but it constantly comes up in therapy shows. And Hollywood in general does a really terrible job with mental health. So there's a lot of demonizing mental health diagnoses. There's a lot of misinformation or bad information, I would say, that comes out whenever mental health is a topic. So while it's a thing that I'm passionate about, I don't super love watching shows about it. One, because I like for my shows to be stress relieving, and a show that reminds me of my job doesn't relieve my stress in the same way that something like a fantasy show or a fictional show might. And two, the inaccuracies really bother me. So it's just one of those things where I usually avoid it. I love Domhnall Gleeson, who is in The Patient. He's Sam, the serial killer, in the show, and he's tremendous. So, and I'm a fan of Steve Carell. Not like a huge fan. I'm not like a mega fan. He's a good actor. People should watch more stuff of his than just The Office. Not saying that only people watch The Office, but you get what I'm saying. He does a nice job. So the show's super well acted. So I decided to give it a shot and thought I could talk about it here. So I'm going to talk about kind of what it does well, what it doesn't do so well, and then kind of give a review because it's my YouTube channel. So I guess I get to review stuff. So I'm going to try, we'll see. I'm going to try and make sure I don't do any spoilers until like partially through the video, and then give a warning for spoilers ahead. So in case you haven't watched it, why you would watch my review of it before you watch the show, no idea, but just in case. So yeah, The Patient. It's pitched as a therapist gets kidnapped by a serial killer patient. So no spoilers there. That's the pitch. It's the first few minutes of the show. The first episode is cringy and terrible from a therapy perspective. Alan, Steve Carell's character, is a therapist, a fairly well-known therapist in the universe of the show. He's published several books. He's fairly well-known. His clients read his books. His clients find him because he's written a book, blah, blah, blah. So there's like a weird montage of Alan with a couple of his clients, and it's like the cringiest, most inaccurate Hollywood tropey stuff of therapy ever. A client is like in the middle of or nearing the end of session and is like, oh, I think we're running out of time. That's all the time we have. And Alan's like, that's my job. And then the client who's off camera goes, oh, I'm doing your job for you again. And it's like some weird like people pleasing thing. And it's like, ugh. If I ever act that way with any of my clients, I hope they never come see me again, because that's super terrible and disingenuous. So it's like this weird idea, I think, of therapy as like this, Alan's like kind of stuffy and like very formulaic in how he does his work. And I'd like to think that therapy as a profession has moved towards a little bit more of like genuinely people helping people as people. Like therapists are people too. So it's kind of like that weird old idea. I think Alan does some version of, I don't know. He never identifies like how he approaches therapy. The show's very clearly set on the East Coast. I don't know if that's like in universe that it's on the East Coast, but just the style of therapy is like too Freudian to be somewhere else. Freudian therapy is psychoanalysis is only popular on the East Coast. Nobody does it except for people on the East Coast. And I'm overgeneralizing probably here because somebody in Nebraska probably is a big fan, but like, nah, it's super not popular. Freud's work doesn't hold up over time. So not a ton of people do it. It takes forever. So insurance companies rarely pay for it. It's just a bad way of doing therapy. Anyway, he doesn't necessarily identify that he does that style of therapy, but like his therapy is kind of like Hollywood eye-rolling, cringe-inducing, not what I would consider anything like therapy to be. And it's very built on like him being the expert, right? So he's written some books. So we're introduced to Sam, who is Domhnall Gleeson's character, and Sam starts seeing calls Alan and leaves a message, and like it's a broken, like, this guy has problems. So as a therapist, I'll get a lot of calls from clients who are reaching out to do a consultation. I offer a free 15-minute phone consult to see if we're a good fit. So like it's kind of that message, and it's like he's not stuttering, but like his speech is very broken, and like he's taking pauses, and like seems weird, right? Like so that's kind of our introduction to Sam. Sam talks about some stuff that isn't super relevant. We find out later he's kind of like testing Alan to see if he can be a good psychiatrist or a good therapist for him or not. So it's like a bit of an interesting, like, kind of bait and switch, in that we're introduced to Sam, but then we find out more about him as the show goes on. So Sam then kidnaps Alan and locks him to a bed in his basement. Premise of the show. So in the first couple episodes, there's very little therapy that happens, honestly. For a show that a main character is a therapist, and he's supposed to be doing therapy with a serial killer, like, there's not a ton of therapy. Alan and Sam have like weird brief sessions, if you could call it that. And it's a half-hour show, too. So, like, therapy sessions are an hour long. You have a show that's half an hour, so it's got to move plot points along and include some therapy stuff. Like, there's just not a ton of time for the therapy stuff. And what it is all kind of like cringy and eye-rolling. Even later in the show, when there's more therapy-like sessions, it's not great, and it doesn't take up a bunch of time. So I'd say overall, the show does a pretty poor job of portraying what therapy is actually like, even though the show is about a therapist doing therapy with a serial killer client. It's so far removed from reality that it's, I think, inoffensive. As I got into the show, I was kind of like not really bothered by the inaccuracies of it, because it's such like a wild premise. So to any serial killers out there, like, don't kidnap your therapists. They're not going to do therapy with you. Like, therapy needs to work in a specific setting. You can't kidnap a therapist and force them to do therapy somewhere else. It won't work. Like, therapy needs to be a safe space. And so kidnapping your therapist, terrible idea. I'm located in Wisconsin. We've had several famous serial killers from here. Some of the most famous serial killers are from here. Although Ed Gein was probably a grave robber. So anyway, let's talk about Sam a little bit. Sam's the serial killer. Sam, we never get like a clear diagnosis. I'm going to talk about a couple. I don't like using the word controversial. I'm going to talk about a couple things, knowing that other people in the same profession that I'm in would talk about them differently. But this is kind of my take on some of them. So Sam's clearly on the autism spectrum somewhere. He has a really hard time processing when people aren't following the rules. He's very, very, very particular about the rules. His job is as a health inspector for restaurants, and like takes it very seriously. And that's, honestly, he's high functioning on the spectrum, and that's probably a great job for him, because there's a lot of rules to remember. There's a lot of like very specific things that he needs to do in a very specific order. So he seems to be quite successful at it. He has an interaction with his boss later on in the show, and like he seems to be in like pretty good standing at work, if maybe like a little too good at it, because of how meticulous he is. So that kind of fits. Sam has a really hard time processing human emotion. He just misses social cues. He's aware enough to know that he's bad at it, but like he doesn't know what to do about it instead. That's true in his relationship with his ex-wife. That's true in his interactions with Alan. That's true in his interactions with his school guidance counselor. Makes an appearance later on in the show. And Sam's just awkward throughout. Like, he does not know how to react to other people's social cues, which is a key component in autism spectrum disorder. So yeah, he's on the spectrum somewhere. I'm not a specialist in autism. I had the privilege of working with an autism specialist early on in my career, which was super nice. It just means I didn't work with it very often, because why would somebody work with me when they could go see someone who specializes in that right down the hall for me? So it's a thing that like I'm very familiar with on the one hand, but also haven't done a ton of work, and know that there's like a level of expertise that I don't have around that. And there's also like, even starting this YouTube channel took me a long time, just because I had to get over kind of the mental block of like diagnosing fictional characters is a terrible idea, because it's not real, and so you're not going to be able to get a lot of the nuance that comes with actual diagnosis, and you don't diagnose people who aren't your clients. Like, so I don't feel bad diagnosing fictional characters because they're not real people, but also they're not my clients. And as a therapist, you should never diagnose someone who's not in the room, who isn't your client. So I see this a lot with people who will come to therapy. This is just a tangent about therapists doing bad therapy. I see this a lot with people who have done bad therapy in the past. They've had a therapist who wasn't very good, and that therapist will be like, oh, well, your partner has this. And they're like, but you weren't doing couples therapy, so how could they diagnose your partner? So therapists, stop diagnosing other people who aren't in the room. You can't do that. So Sam's not my client. I shouldn't, in theory, be diagnosing him. He's on the spectrum somewhere. The controversial takes go from here then. I think obviously people would say he's got antisocial personality disorder. I don't diagnose personality disorders. I think every personality disorder has a trauma history. So it doesn't make sense to kind of demonize the trauma responses with a label that doesn't fit. Something like borderline personality disorder is way over diagnosed in the African American community and very heavily overrepresented in the female community. So like, it's a bad diagnosis because the way that the diagnosis is written, the way that you would look for telltale signs that someone has this disorder is very much overrepresented in two different minorities, females and African Americans. So like, it's a bad diagnosis is written by like old stuffy white men who didn't have a good world experience for frame of reference. And so it's a bad diagnosis. Something like antisocial personality disorder is probably a little bit more reasonable, but it's kind of like a catch-all used for like serial killers and psychopaths. Like, there's a book that came out, I don't know, maybe a decade ago now. I'm older than I feel. I was like The Psychopath Next Door or something. It was how like 1 in 4 people would qualify for like antisocial personality disorder diagnosis, which like, again, probably means it's just a garbage diagnosis. But how like people who are CEOs and some people who do very well in society are probably psychopaths because like they get ahead by not caring about other people. Like, if you are a CEO for like and your company makes insulin and you're cool with like a 6,000% markup and you're making like millions, if not billions of dollars while people can't afford their life-saving medication that costs $1 to make, like, right, you're probably a psychopath. I'm oddly okay with the label psychopath, but not personality disorder. The other weird thing with personality disorders is like, in the business of therapy, it's a diagnosis that follows people. So if you get that label attached to you, it's very hard to shake it. And as soon as a therapist hears that you've been diagnosed with it, like, it changes the way they're going to look at you. So it's just one of those things that comes with, even in the mental health profession, a lot of stigma. It's just one of those things that like, it screams to therapists, this person's hard to deal with. So I don't like it. I think it comes with too much baggage. I think it's a sign that at some point you probably had a lazy therapist, because they should be doing the trauma work instead of just slapping the personality disorder label on. But it is a thing that comes up with a lot of serial killers. There's some other stuff that comes up with Sam. He has a fixation with food, and I didn't think of this in terms of autism spectrum, although it probably fits. Hyper fascination with something. But it's such a weird like trope in anime, and I don't watch a ton of anime, but the anime that I do watch, or I have watched, which is very little, all has this as like a trope where like food's a really big point. And so Sam's preoccupation with food, actually, I kind of process that as like, oh, that's weird, that's an anime too. Watch Dorohedoro, One Punch Man, Cowboy Bebop. There's one other one that I'm missing. I'll have like a preoccupation with food as like part of the episode. So I watched it as like that's weird. I wonder if that's a trope that I'm unaware of, as opposed to thinking of it as in terms of like a diagnosis. From a filmmaking perspective, Oh, I'm a cultural studies minor, so I guess I can comment with the tiny bit of knowledge I have because I took like 3 classes on film. Um, the idea that like you don't put something in a show if it isn't relevant. So if you introduce a gun, that gun at some point has to go off. Like, and I think it goes back pre-television. I think it's a play term. I'm drawing a blank on it. I thought about it for this video, and now I'm drawing a blank on it during the video. But anyway, like the concept is if you introduce something, it needs to be relevant to the story, otherwise it shouldn't be in the story. So Sam always comes home with food, gives it to Alan before they do any therapy. He goes into his room, closes the door, and then he just pees for like so long in every episode. And it's weird and it's uncomfortable. And it has to be in the show for a reason, right? From a filmmaking perspective, we kind of know it has to be in there. The showrunners wanted it to be in there for some reason. The only thing I could think of, and maybe this has completely gone over my head because sometimes I miss very obvious things, is what used to be known as, I think, but it's still known, it's just been debunked. But McDonald's triad or predictor for serial killers was cruelty to animal, fascination with setting fires, and chronic bedwetting. That came out in like the 60s, I think, late 60s maybe. It's been debunked. It has no predictive value. All those things have to do with trauma. We know that a lot of serial killers, not necessarily a causal relationship, but we know there's a strong relationship between either abuse or neglect. Both of those things are traumatic in childhood for serial killers. So like, again, it's been debunked. But the only thing I can think of is it has kind of survived, even though it's been debunked, it's kind of survived our pop culture awareness that serial killers are chronic bedwetters. Even saying that is false. But it comes from like an actual paper that was published back in the 60s that has subsequently been debunked. It has no causal relationship. It is of no predictive value. It's just untrue. There are other factors that fit better and explain more that are also don't have a causal or predictive relationship. Not everybody who's neglected as a child or abused as a child becomes a serial killer. So again, the relationship is weak. That said, that was the only thing I could come up with, like why he's urinating for just so very long in pretty much every episode. There could be something with like urine retention or like holding, like refusing to go to the bathroom in public. I don't know. I'm not like a FBI behavioral analyst who studies serial killers extensively. I have an odd fascination with serial killers from my childhood because we grew up, watching the Dahmer series recently. Like, right, that was a couple minutes away from my high school. Like, my mom didn't let my older brother go outside at night because, like, there was a bunch of murders happening in Milwaukee, which is where I'm from. So, not that I remember that because Dahmer was arrested, I think, when I was like 3. But my brother's 8 years older than me, so he was 11. So anyway, I grew up with that, and Ed Gein's from Wisconsin. Ed Gein probably wasn't a serial killer. Ed Gein was probably a grave robber. He probably only killed his brother, so not a serial killer, just murdered one person. But then he was a grave robber, and he made weird skin suits and collected ears and vulvas and a bunch of different weird dead, dry skin from human bodies. Ed Gein's part of the premise for Bill the Butcher in Silence of the Lambs. So anyway, weird fascination with serial killers because I'm from Wisconsin and we have a couple pretty famous serial killers. Where was I going with that? I lost my train of thought. I'm not a behavioral analyst. I've had multiple people say I remind them of Reed from Criminal Minds, which is a CBS, I think, show. I don't know. I didn't watch it a ton. CBS shows are poorly done. They're super full of tropes and inaccuracies. CSI did a lot of damage to people's perceptions of police departments and how effective they are at solving crimes because most police departments don't have crime labs like that, and most crimes don't get processed like that. There's huge backlogs on stuff like this. So anyway, those are basically just propaganda pieces like Criminal Minds and CSI and whatever else they're doing that is just this bad TV. First of all, like those are poorly done shows, and they're wildly inaccurate. Like poorly done from enjoyment of watching them perspective. Anyway, so like that's kind of what we know of Sam. I saw some criticism on like he would have been caught, blah blah blah. Like I don't think so. Like I think the show does a pretty good job in the sense of here's somebody who like really randomly kills people, and like again, he's not like okay, he maybe is leaving like fingerprints behind, but if he's not been fingerprinted anywhere, like that doesn't get caught. And again, like some of this crime lab stuff, some of the stuff that we think like everything can get CSI'd, like it doesn't though. Like that's how serial killers get away with these things for so long. There's a bunch of serial killers operating within the United States right now who've never been caught. Not to be like doom and gloom about it, but it's a common thing. So yeah, I don't think he would have been caught. People talk about like he must have been super strong. Again, I don't think so. Like I think catching somebody by surprise isn't that hard, and over like subduing them, most people aren't trained in self-defense or like fighting for their lives. So it's kind of a thing where it's like, yeah, he could strangle someone. Everybody he strangles like tries to stop him from strangling them, which is a very ineffective way of fighting for your life. Like you have to harm your attacker, not try and break their hold. Like that's a very ineffective way to do it. So like sure, it doesn't take particularly long, I don't think, to strangle someone. This is going to make me all sound really terrible, all these things that I'm saying. A former coworker of mine, this is not a thing that I looked up or I knew out of interest, someone shared this with me, but to bite someone's finger off like is about the same bite strength as biting a baby carrot. I don't know if that's true or not. That's what an athletic trainer told me, so I feel like they have some awareness, but why they knew that, no idea. I could be propagating falsehoods in this. Don't quote me on that. I was told by someone else who has some professional relation to the physical body, so they seem like more of an expert on it than me, so I took them at their word. Alan. All right, this is where I think I can't. Spoilers ahead. I don't think I can talk about the show without having some spoilers here. Most of the therapy in the show is actually Alan dissociating from his predicament of being kidnapped and locked into a serial killer's basement and chained to the bed. Most of the therapy that happens in the show is Alan and his former therapist, who I think died. I guess I'm not clear on if that therapist is dead or Alan's just aware that it's not real, because I think Alan's therapist died. So Alan is still processing the grief of his wife dying. That's a big part of the show, which I think the show does a good job of, like complex grief that hasn't been processed. The show is very much about Alan and his son Ezra and their strained relationship because of the unprocessed grief of his wife dying, and his wife had a very contentious relationship with Ezra, his son, and now that she's gone, he's left with all this like unresolved stuff. And there's also generational trauma, which I think the show does a good job of showing. Alan is Jewish. There's religious trauma thrown in there too, which is super fun. Alan is Jewish, and so some of his dissociations while he's in captivity are like from the Holocaust, are from things that he didn't experience in his own life, but he's kind of like processing some of his cultural trauma. And generational trauma is a real thing. We know that people who are born to parents who have had significant trauma in their lives have different genetic markers that kind of signify that trauma gets passed on. So the way that they process stress, or the way that like, even physical ailments, somebody who, a parent who's dealing with a lot of stress in their pregnancy, like their child might have deficiencies in like the amount of nutrients in their bones or in their teeth. They could have like all sorts of stuff that we can just track as like, oh, that's like a weird thing from the parent's pregnancy that then passed on to the kid because those stress hormones were so prevalent in that child's development. So we kind of know that some of these things can get passed on. Some of it's genetic markers, and then some of it's trauma. And so I think the show did a really good job with that. I think Alan's grief lingering, even though he's a therapist and he knows breathing techniques and he does all the stress relief and he knows that he needs to process the grief, he doesn't have it. One of the things that I talk a lot with my clients who are dealing with grief is having like a system to deal with grief. And that's one of the few perks of a religious background, I think, in the sense that because Alan's Jewish, he has like mourning based on Um, Judaism has rules on how to deal with a dead body and how to mourn for that dead body, mourn for that person, and all these different things. So there's a bunch of structural rules and regulations around mourning, and that gives people comfort when they're going through grief because their brain doesn't necessarily know how to process the loss. And so having a bunch of rules and regulations are actually pretty helpful. So that's one of the things that he's kind of processing. But there's some religious trauma thrown in there, with things that were unhelpful scripturally that caused harm to Alan's wife and therefore to Alan. There are schisms within the family related to Judaism. Ezra is much more orthodox. Alan's wife was seemed to be much more progressive or liberal. I'm not sure what the term is. So that highlights, again, I think, like a really good family dynamic in the sense of that's a very real thing. Parenting, we always think of as like 0 to 18, and that is the focus of parenting, and that should be the priority of parenting. But where a lot of problems in families come up is actually once your kids are adults, because that individuation process of a child turning into an adult and becoming their own person, like they don't fit the roles of their family of origin. There's new research I just saw recently that said like 27% of people have an estranged family member or are estranged from a family member. So it's way more common than people think that, like, right, some part of your family of origin isn't healthy for you as an adult. You kind of have to break up with it. And I think that comes up a lot. I do a lot of boundaries work with people. And so that's a big thing, is like, if this person's not willing to work on it in a healthy way, like the only option you have is to kind of cut them out of your life. Certain people are just unhealthy. They're toxic to be around. They demand a ton of resources from you while giving nothing back. So they're a drain on your energy and on your well-being. And those people we need to have really strict boundaries with. So typically we set strong boundaries with them, and those people break our boundaries. And so then at some point we're just left with the idea of like, yeah, we don't have other option other than to not deal with that person. So I thought the show did a nice job with that, but it's still complex. Like, you can feel really good about having cut someone out of your life, a family member who's toxic out of your life, but there's still like a grieving process that goes with that, and it's kind of an ongoing thing. It's different than grieving the loss of someone who's died, because that's a permanent thing where that person is like still around. Maybe you've got grandkids that you see, but you don't have a good relationship with the in-laws or whatever. So these relationships of estrangement with a family member who's still alive are kind of more complicated. I don't want to say more complicated in a different way than the loss of someone like through death, which is a much more permanent thing. And we can work our way towards peace or acceptance much more easily because of the permanence of it. So I thought that the family dynamic, the religious trauma dynamic, the generational trauma dynamic was all really good, except it wasn't real therapy, right? So Alan's dissociating while he's chained to the bed in the basement of his serial killer client. So he's projecting what he would have wanted his therapist to say to him. I don't think it was wildly like bad therapy, other than it was kind of like that eye-rollingly like, your therapist has these like vague generic platitudes they give you, and that somehow causes breakthroughs. I do think it's true that most of my clients know what's best for them and don't super need me to fix anything. I don't fix any of my clients' problems, but a lot of my clients do want direction. They want to tap into the expertise that I have. So it's not like I'm like this blank slate who just asks these vague questions. People always think therapy is like, how does that make you feel? Like, that's not a question I ask very often. I'm not an emotionally focused therapist, which is like EFT, emotionally focused therapy, is a style of therapy. So I'm saying, not that I ignore emotions, but that I'm not specializing in that type of therapy that focuses specifically on getting clients to focus on their emotions. Emotions are a big part of things. I talk about congruence as, I talk about wellness, health as being congruence, in which our belief systems are in congruence and aligned with our behaviors, which are aligned with our emotions and our thoughts. So our thoughts and emotions start, that leads to behaviors, and then all that has to kind of fall under our belief system. And when those things all are in alignment, we feel really good. And when those things are off, we're left with either like some sort of cognitive dissonance or that's where mental health problems come from, is not being congruent in those things, not being aligned in those things, in my opinion. So I thought the show did a nice job with some of the things in Alan's life, more than the catchy serial killer type of character in Sam. Um, if you're still watching, I don't think I gave out any major spoilers, but now I'm going to. The show absolutely ended the correct way in that Sam kills Alan. Like, I was watching almost concerned that that wouldn't happen, which as soon as he kidnapped him, like, that was the outcome, right? Um, that's what would happen. So I was glad that they went that way. Not just because like I like shows that have dark endings, but because like I think that's the most genuine thing. Like the survival rate of a situation like that's very low. Not to be doom and gloom, just like again the reality. It's not great to be kidnapped by a serial killer. It's pretty bad for you. Um, so that's good. Alan like working up the courage to kind of like try and break away and escape by uh, having a standoff by capturing Sam's mom. Really good. Um, Going back to Sam for a minute here, because I'm not sure if I made the connection in my head. I'm not sure if I said it out loud. Sam has trauma from his childhood, so that explains like anything that would have been covered in a personality disorder. Like Sam was abused over and over again. Um, we meet Sam's abuser, which was his father, who justifies beating Sam as you were a weird kid. You didn't play games. You were really hard to deal with. Probably because Sam's on the spectrum. And so, like, that's horrific, right? Like, that's terrible. There's no justified reason to hit your kid. We know that spanking children, like, we definitively know spanking your children causes trauma. So, like, don't do that. Don't spank your kids. There's no justification for hitting people. When we start thinking of, like, religious trauma, like, spare the rod, spoil the child is a bad reading of scripture that didn't say that. It was about using a shepherd's crook to like curb people's behavior, not to beat them. So like, I don't know the history of how that got taken out of context, but it very much got taken out of context. I know the religious right in America has very much like made authoritarian dictatorship style of parenting to be like okay to hit your kids, and a bunch of people in my age range of being millennials were raised by people who grew up in the 80s and like a bunch of like Dobson and some other religious evangelical right-wing nut job type people made it okay to beat your kids. It's not okay to beat your kids. It's not up for debate. Don't hit your children. It's bad for them. So we know Sam was traumatized in his childhood. He was beaten by his dad. He has a weird relationship with his mom, who is also, I think we're led to believe, I don't know if the show says outright, but also abused. So divorced dad, but Sam still lives with mom. And mom very much knows he's a serial killer and like refuses to turn him in. So that dynamic's pretty weird and janky. It's again another stereotype. I think this one is much stronger relationship. That many serial killers have issues with their parents. Specifically, the mother relationship gets a lot of dynamic. That dynamic gets highlighted, but most of the serial killers who get caught are men. So that dynamic makes more sense in the context of most children who have issues with their parents. It's the opposite gender parent. So mother-in-law across both genders is the most complicated relationship, statistically speaking. Most people report that as being the most contentious relationship in their life. So yeah, I thought the show did a good job with like that parental aspect, in that part of Sam's being a serial killer isn't justified by him being abused, but that's a pretty common thing, either abuse or neglect in a serial killer's childhood. So I thought that was good. Sam ends up not killing his dad, which was, I think, an interesting thing. But within the universe context we're given of Sam needs his victims to break some set of rules. They break some social norm and disrespect him or humiliate him. So his dad definitely disrespected and humiliated him, but his dad, when they interact as adults, his dad doesn't break any social norms. There's no rule that, not social norms, social contracts, social rules. There's no rule that gets broken. And so Sam, while he wants to kill his dad for revenge and out of like violence, a desire for violence, he doesn't go through with it. So that I thought was like interesting too, but makes sense. And the idea of what his justification is for killing people is they broke some rule and therefore need to be punished. It should be an obvious rule to not abuse your kids. So again, like playing a little fast and loose with that, but family of origin does some weird things to our brain. We don't always apply standards or rules or boundaries we have in our lives to our family of origin. It's very hard as an adult to like conceptualize that because it's something from before we were able to look at things logically, because our family of origin was with us before our brain was done growing. So a bunch of boundaries work that I do with people is around their family of origin because it's a complicated thing. So Sam's mom as a character is an interesting character in that like she kind of like tolerates it and allows it to happen. I don't know. I guess I can fathom how that's realistic. I'm not sure how accurate that would be. I work with the analogy I have, which is not an exact analogy, is working with people who have children who are drug addicts, and like most of them get to a point where like they push for their kid to get help because they come to the awareness that they can't help their kid anymore. They've done a lot of, not always, sometimes they've done a lot of behaviors trying to be helpful that are enabling the addiction. So I don't know. I tend to think like a parent at some point is going to turn their kid in because they want their kid to get help. I've never worked with a parent of a serial killer, so I can't weigh in on that definitively. But I think of all of the characters in the show, that was maybe the most interesting. Not a character that gets super fleshed out. So the therapy in the show is pretty bad. I don't know that Alan's reaction to being kidnapped and held captive is particularly realistic. So it's kind of like a fictional show, in my opinion. I thought it was supremely well acted. Steve Carell is great in it. He, again, is actually a very good actor. A lot of people in my age range know him from like The 40-Year-Old Virgin and from The Office, which are good roles. He did very well with them. I never finished The Office. I know people might hate on that. I just couldn't sit through the whole thing. And I'm a fan of the David Brent character, Ricky Gervais's character in the UK version of The Office. The American Office is too sitcom-y. I'm off track here. I'm aware. But no, Steve Carell and Domhnall Gleeson are fantastic in it. It's a very well acted show, I think, and just kind of like briefly perusing some of the videos or the reviews online is that like it's very well acted, which I would agree with. So it's a very watchable show. Just fictional. It's not a good take on what therapy's like. It's not, I don't think, a good take on, it doesn't have a whole lot of interesting things to say on the topic of mental health. I think it has more interesting things to say on like family dynamics and on religion than it does on anything related to mental health. Brings up some interesting talking points around grief and loss and death, I think, but doesn't do anything particularly interesting with them, just kind of like broaches them as topics and then doesn't do a whole lot with them. So super well acted, not particularly realistic, but if you're kind of like in the mood for something serial killer-esque but don't want to watch like something horrifically accurate like Dahmer, which isn't accurate but like really did happen, is based on a real person, so like horrific in the sense that actually happened. And I haven't watched the Dahmer show. I watched the first episode and then watched the documentary that's like the recorded tapes of him. Didn't watch the whole show. But yeah, if you want something that's like serial killer-esque, but you don't want something that's problematic and like making money off of victims and stuff like that, then I think it's good. It's a good fictional take on serial killers, but it's fictional for sure. So yeah, I thought it was a good show. I watched the whole thing. I think it's an enjoyable show. It's well done without being like particularly provocative or having a ton to say on any particular topic. So yeah, that's my review of The Patient from FX, starring Steve Carell and Domhnall Gleeson. Check it out. That's all I got today. Peace out, peeps.